The book that we are about to begin is one of the most famous in the 20th century. Here's what some critics have said. The word Orwellian, from the author Orwell, is now a universal shorthand for anything repressive or totalitarian. So Orwell himself has entered our language. 1984 is the definitive book of the 20th century. This novel will disturb you with its very plausibility, says the Christian Science Monitor, who ranked this number 5 on its classic political novels list. And Time magazine says, it is Orwell's triumph and the century's misfortune that 1984 is as prescient, that is, predictive, as it is pessimistic. Welcome to 1984. 1984 is also part of our pop culture, and this is a really famous ad that Apple played during the Super Bowl in the year 1984, over 40 years after the book was initially published.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created one of the most tiny in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory rules. Unification of laws is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Based on this commercial, you probably have some predictions about what 1984 will sound and feel and look like. Hold on to those thoughts. Okay, so you should have gotten that we are in a dystopian place. What does it mean to be dystopian? Well, dystopia is the opposite of a utopia, the world where everything is perfect, and it's roughly synonymous with dysfunction. If you think about why we read dystopian novels, they start to issue warnings about dangers within society or criticize societies by showing how harmful they can be. In other words, dystopian novels tell us what will happen if we don't fix things or if things continue in the direction that they have started. So they work as warnings in a lot of ways. Let's think about Orwell as a utopian or a dystopian, an idealist or a cynic. We can try to figure out what he thought about the world by thinking about where he came from and what his biography has been. So here's Orwell's background. He was born in 1903 in India, which was at that point a British colony. And this is an actual picture of his house. His family was decently well off, but not wealthy. They were part of the middle class of British people in India. His birth name was Eric Blair. When he was 8, he was sent off to St. Cyprian's boarding school in England, which is this building here. And this was actually really formative for him. He hated it, and he felt controlled and spied upon and abused while he was there. And these themes show up in his work later. In an essay he wrote called Such Were the Joys about his experiences at his school, he wrote, "At the boarding school, your home might be far from perfect, but at least it was a place ruled by love rather than fear, where you did not have to be perpetually on your guard against the people surrounding you. At 8 years old, you were suddenly taken out of this warm nest and flung into a world of force and fraud and secrecy." Clearly, he didn't like St. Cyprian's very much. In the 1920s, after he graduated from Eton, he went back to India, and he actually worked in the Secret Service. If you recall, India was a British colony, and there were uprisings like the Salt March and protests against British rule. So you can imagine he saw some difficult things as a police officer in India, and that actually is your friend, George Orwell, right there in the back of the police academy. As he got older, he started to develop new political ideas. In 1927, he came back to England, and he was tired of the upper-middle-class imperialist ideals of his parents' generation. Instead, in England, he started to live among the poor, and he became a socialist, a member of that political party, and wrote for a newspaper. Pay special attention to this picture of the newsroom at that time because it's remarkably similar to what Winston's job will be in 1984. So envision that, when you envision Winston working. He wrote 2 really well-known novels. In the 1940s, in World War II, he was a member of the British Home Guard, which is like our National Guard and means that he did not actually go abroad to fight. In 1943, he published Animal Farm, and it was critical of Stalin's, quote, socialist leadership in Russia. Recall that Orwell was also a socialist, so if he was critical of Stalin, you can make some guesses about what Stalin's government was actually like. His second major novel is 1984, and these are an array of different covers of 1984 from around the world. Based on these, you might be able to predict some of the themes or the tone that we will have in the book. So he wrote 1984 in the year 1948. So when he wrote this book, it was more than 40 years, or almost 40 years in the future. You see that it's kind of the reversal of 48, and it is a world turned upside down. He wrote this book after World War II and the Holocaust, and it was very critical of totalitarian leaders. So think about some of the key events that shaped Orwell's thinking about the world. He saw the Russian Revolution, both its ideals and its broken promises, which he traced in Animal Farm. He saw Stalin rise to power in the Soviet Union. And he also saw Hitler rise to power in Germany, and both of those societies struggle with their dictatorships. And then he saw the threat of global warfare, ongoing military threats even after the end of World War II. Based on those things, it's pretty clear how he ended up as a dystopian thinker. One of the words that we use to describe the setting of 1984 is the apocalypse. Apocalypse means great or total devastation or doom, and it's featured in movies and in video games like the one below. This idea of the vision of the end of the world and the punishment of sinners shows up in all of the world's major religions, as well as literature and in films and things like that. If we think about Orwell as an apocalyptic thinker, think about some of the events that he has seen that might have been considered apocalyptic. These are some pictures that hopefully will jar your schema. So you might recognize in 1945 in that first image, the atomic bomb dropped on Japan, and that is the destruction of Hiroshima, as well as the bomb next to it. Nuclear war became a possibility in the 20th century. The Cold War and its potential for mass destruction kind of appeared on the horizon. He also saw World War I, where there were millions dead and little gained, as you know from All Quiet on the Western Front. And then in World War II, both the Holocaust, the persecution of the Jews, and the rise of the dictatorships were all horrible things that happened in the world during Orwell's lifetime. So think about, as an observer of these events, what these events teach us about ourselves and what we are capable of. And then I think you start to realize why Orwell approached his literature the way that he did. The specific book we are jumping into is 1984, and his setting is called Oceania. It's a military society. If you look at the world map, you'll notice that there are only 4 colors, and in Oceania's world, the world of 1984, the entire world has been divided into only 3 superpower countries. The orange areas are parts of Oceania, the purple areas are Eurasia, and the green areas are East Asia. There's a small section that is disputed, but in Orwell's world, these 3 major world countries are in constant warfare with each other for control of those disputed areas. Our story takes place in London. It's set after World War II, and London is now called Airstrip 1. If you look at the small orange island to the left side of purple Europe, you'll see England, and Winston lives in England in London, now called Airstrip 1. You'll notice the society has echoes of Stalin's Russia after the revolution, or Nazi Germany, so a European dictatorship under a very strong ruler. And Oceania are the victors of a futuristic global war that involves Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. These 3 countries are constantly fighting to be the winners of that war. The party is in control of Oceania. They run the government. They are a totalitarian system. In the graph, you see the 3 different groups of the party and their relative percentages of the population. Oceania is governed by a 1% minority, which are called the inner party. You see them on a tiny little sliver on that graph. Below the inner party are the support personnel. They make up 9% of the population. They're called the outer party. And our main character, Winston, is a member of the outer party. So he's still part of the government, but has nowhere near as much power or knowledge as members of the inner party. And then the vast majority of the party, the proles, are the common workers, and they make up 90% of the population of Oceania. The term prole comes from Marx's term, the proletariat, that is, the workers. The proles are contained or controlled by a number of brainwashing devices and are not treated well in Oceania. One of the things that runs throughout the book, 1984, is this idea that Big Brother is watching you. And Orwell describes in the very first chapter the posters of Big Brother that are posted all around the city. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide, the face of a man about 45, with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. And if you are imagining someone who looks a lot like Stalin, that's probably not a coincidence. You can see where Orwell might have gotten the inspiration for this poster from an actual World War II propaganda poster that warned British citizens of potential Nazi spies. The thought police is another terrifying component of 1984, and Orwell describes them this way. They persecute you if you commit thought crime, and he says that thought crime was not a thing that could be concealed forever. You might dodge successfully for a while, even for years, but sooner or later they were bound to get you. You can guess then that thought crime is thoughts that go against the government, and this quote implies that even thoughts against the government are enough to get you in trouble, and that the government will somehow find out that you're having them. Oceania is governed by 4 ministries or government departments. This is one imagined image of what it might look like. This is actually Pyongyang in North Korea. And this is a building in London that people think was perhaps the inspiration for the buildings that Orwell describes in 1984 as where the ministries are housed. There are 4 ministries. The first is the Ministry of Truth, Mini-True. And because Orwell is ironic and the society is dystopian, everything kind of does the opposite of what it says it does. So the Ministry of Truth is in charge of lies, but it publishes the news. The Ministry of Love, clearly, purveys hate, mini-love, and it is in charge of the law. And so you can guess what kind of law is administered in Oceania. The Ministry of Plenty, or mini-plen, is in charge of the economy. And you can guess then that the economy never has quite enough of anything. And finally, the Ministry of Peace, or mini-pax, is clearly in charge of waging war. You'll see in 1984 Winston confront propaganda posters and videos that make him feel afraid that he's under attack by foreign powers. And again, these are things that Orwell would have seen in his lifetime. On the left, we have this super racist portrayal of a Nazi soldier and a Japanese soldier who are ready to attack the United States to make people feel afraid of outside enemies. And then on the right-hand side, another American poster, Private Joe Louis, who is a boxer, said, "We're going to do our part and we'll win because we're on God's side." So these propagandist ideas that there are enemies outside and that we are on the side of the right are things that also show up in 1984. So you can make some predictions for 1984 based on your reading of Animal Farm. There's an idea called a study, which is a sketch that an artist makes before he or she makes the final piece of art. And this is a study of a very famous painting. See if you can guess who the artist is who made this sketch. And if you're thinking Picasso, you're right. This is a Picasso sketch for his very famous major painting called Guernica, which shows the horrors of war. Based on the sketch, you might be able to predict what the finished work might look like. In a similar way, some readers and critics think that Animal Farm is a study for 1984. In other words, that Animal Farm is a place where Orwell tests out or sketches out some ideas that he will then explore and expand on in 1984. If Animal Farm is a study for 1984, what predictions can you then make about 1984? What ideas, events, characters, tensions might Orwell explore in this second major novel? Go ahead and make those predictions now, and we're jumping into 1984 right away.